All right, guys. So a couple of days ago, I saw a kind of shocking monologue or segment here from an MSNBC host, Joy Reid, where she's actually going to tear into Kamala Harris over Israel and Gaza and basically make the case that in the wake of that recent bombing I covered a couple of days ago, where Israel struck a school that was housing displaced Palestinians and killed over 100 people, she's making the point that words are not enough. And if you are going to break from the Biden administration on this issue, you kind of actually have to make it clear what your position is, right? So let's go ahead and watch this short little 2-minute monologue here.
Early Saturday, an Israeli airstrike hit a school serving as a shelter in Gaza, killing at least 100 people and wounding nearly 50 others, according to Palestinian health authorities. On the same day as the strike, Vice President Kamala Harris condemned the loss of civilian life.
Yet again, there are far too many civilians who have been killed. I mean, Israel has a right to go after the terrorists that are Hamas. But as I have said many, many times, they also have, I believe, an important responsibility to avoid civilian casualties.
Uncommitted and anti-war voters see a reset with Harris on Israel and Gaza. Her language is different, capable of moving the needle and gaining favor with some of the voters who rejected President Biden over his stance on the region. But language is not enough. This was a school serving as a shelter for refugees of war, attacked during morning prayers. Witnesses said children, women, and old people were inside, sleeping, and that the school was hit without an evacuation warning from the IDF. President Biden has faced months of public pressure to cut off the supply of weapons to Israel amid its war on Gaza, which has killed about 40,000 people since October. It's why the squad, all elected officials of color, are demanding a ceasefire, despite being targeted for removal from office by staunch supporters of the Netanyahu government and the ongoing bombardment of Gaza. The world is on edge right now, and rightly so. The U.S. is sending more troops to the Middle East to bolster defenses as Israel braces for an attack by Iran. So far, Vice President Harris has shown herself to be better positioned than President Biden to bring the party together on this issue. But we have to remember, Harris is still the vice president serving in the Biden administration. So her policy, should it differ from Biden's, isn't anything that she can implement now. Though it's absolutely fair for people to ask, why are we giving bombs to Israel? And would she keep that policy in place as president? These questions will surely be visible during the Democratic National Convention next week. And how the party answers could impact the election, not to mention the lives of so many Palestinians who have suffered for much too long. For God's sake, this needs to end. And that is tonight's readout.
So a little bit surprising there. Right now, I'm not an avid Joy Reid listener or watcher, so, surprisingly, but if you guys happen to be, then let me know if this is sort of like a standard operating procedure for the Joy Reid hour or whatever her show is called. But, kind of surprising coming from a mainstream establishment media figure. She asks some pretty important questions, right? She brings up some fair points. She says, why are we still sending weapons to Israel? Which, by the way, is not only a violation of international law, as Israel is facing potential arrest warrants for their prime minister, Netanyahu, as well as their defense minister, Yoav Gallant, from the International Court of Justice, but they're also facing an ongoing genocide case at the International Court of Justice. So that's an entirely fair question, when again, it's totally against international law and also domestic law through things like the Leahy Law and the Foreign Assistance Act for us to be sending weapons to Israel. That should be a pretty simple question to answer as to whether or not we should continue sending weapons to this clearly genocidal apartheid government, right? So that's number one. She also, by implication, she didn't name them, but she sort of brought up AIPAC and the fact that pro-Israel lobbying groups have been spending millions and millions of dollars to oust, in some cases unsuccessfully. Ilhan Omar just won her Democratic primary election in Minnesota, so congratulations to her. But in some cases successfully, like with Jamal Bowman, they've been spending millions and millions of dollars to oust squad members because they are critical of the government of Israel. That lobbying should obviously, in any country that wants to pretend to call itself a democracy, be illegal, but we live in the United States, so it is legal, right? And so they have been spending this money to oust them. So she brings up that point. She also brings up that Kamala Harris has to earn the votes of people who were either hesitant or who were going to refuse to vote for Joe Biden. You have to make your position clear. Words are not enough. You actually have to lay out what exactly is your plan to end this genocide. And I'm sorry, but I don't buy the argument that, well, she's the vice president under Biden, so she can't really break from his position on these things. I'm sorry, but that's bullshit, right? If we were talking about Biden wants to raise taxes to 30% on corporations and Kamala wants it to be 35%, so, she can't contradict him right now. I would kind of understand it if it was something like that. We're talking about a genocide. Okay, she said 40,000 roughly have been killed. We've seen estimates that have gone way above and beyond that. The carnage in Gaza is so extreme at this point that experts are estimating that just to clean up the rubble, not to rebuild Gaza, just to clean up the rubble, it may take between 10 to 15 years. They've attacked hospitals and schools and churches and refugee camps and UN shelters, everything under the sun, housing units. They've destroyed a majority of the housing in Gaza. The idea that you can look at this situation, right, and you can come away with the conclusion of, well, I can't really break with Biden because that would break president, right? It's ridiculous. We're talking about a genocide. If you are against this genocide, if you plan on confronting the Netanyahu government, confronting the government of Israel, make that fucking clear, right? Earn the votes of people who were hesitant to vote for Biden, but may actually give you a chance, right? As sort of a clean slate, a fresh start. Make it clear exactly what your position is. But unfortunately, you look at clips like the one that she played at the beginning of that monologue, and it's like, you're talking about a story where Israel just blew up a school. They killed over 100 sheltering Palestinians, a huge bulk of them women and children, which has been a consistent through line for the entirety of this genocide. And her response was what? Kamala's response was indistinguishable from something that Joe Biden would say. Well, Israel has a right to defend themselves, but obviously there have been too many civilians who have been killed. Okay, whoop-de-fucking-do. That's exactly what we've been hearing for the last 10 months of this. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. This is a very simple equation. You cut off the weapons to Israel, or even you openly threaten to cut off the weapons to Israel, and the genocide ends. It's that simple. You want a ceasefire? Well, cease sending them fire. Stop sending them weapons. I mean, it sounds simple because it is. Because it really is that simple. And I have yet to see anything from Kamala Harris, other than maybe on the rhetorical front, slightly, that shows that she would be different than Biden. I brought up the point before that I think that Kamala is probably not ideologically a Zionist in the same way that Biden is. She's not as old as Biden. Biden goes back decades and decades, and he's met with all these Israeli leaders, and he has this great affinity for Israel. And I think he has a warped, outdated perspective on Israel. And so I don't think that that applies necessarily to Kamala Harris. But in order to fix this situation in the short term and in the long term, you're going to have to break from Israel. You are going to have to use the leverage that you have at your disposal as the future president of the United States in order to force them to fall in line. That is the only way that we're going to get change, not just with the ongoing genocide right now, but long term, to address Israeli apartheid, to address the ongoing illegal expansion of settlements and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in the West Bank, the illegal military occupation of Palestinians that has been going on for decade after decade after decade. You're going to have to use some real political capital. And if you're not, then okay, make that clear. And then let's see how many people stay home. Let's see how many people vote third party, right? I mean, I know that some people think that this issue doesn't really matter electorally. I think it does. I mean, you talk about a state like Michigan. You talk about how many young people, again, would stay home, sit on the couch, or would vote for Jill Stein or Cornel West. I think that's significant. I really do. And by the way, it's not as if this is bad politics. It's not only good policy, but it's good politics. A vast majority of the American people have wanted a ceasefire for a very long time. A majority of the American people for a very long time think that we should not continue to send weapons to Israel. A majority of the Democratic Party, your coalition, believe that Israel is committing a genocide. You know how extreme and over the top Israel would have had to have been and has been in order for a majority of Democrats to say they're committing a genocide? That's not an easy case to make, right? Especially to the American people, with decades and decades of propaganda, pro-Israel propaganda, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim propaganda that has been implanted into the American psyche for decades. You know how difficult it is to get to that position, and yet the American people see through the bullshit, and they've arrived at that position. So it's good politics and it's good policy to reject the current status quo with the American relationship with Israel. People are fed up with this shit. So make your position clear. It's really that simple. And I guess credit to Joy Reid for making that case here. We'll have to see what Kamala does moving forward. I'm sure she's going to continue to get protested. Again, we saw one protest at one of her recent rallies the first time that it happened, and her response was awful, just terrible. Her response was basically to sneer at the protesters and to say, if you just want Trump to win, then just say that. Really? You're looking at anti-genocide protesters and saying, oh, you must just want Trump to win. How dare you criticize me for being the fucking vice president? Right? She's not some generic Democrat. She's the vice president. She's in the Biden administration that has been arming and funding and facilitating and giving diplomatic cover for this genocide for 10 straight months. You're not some no-name Democrat who just rose up the ranks. You're the vice president. And so you're being confronted, and your response is to sneer at them and to say, you must like Donald Trump. But then the second time that she got protested at one of her rallies, she had a different response, which maybe that's some sort of an indication that she's at least susceptible to pressure. And in the second time when she got protested, her response was basically, kind of the same bullshit that we just saw at the beginning of this Joy Reid clip, where she says, I hear you, I see you, we're working towards a ceasefire. Which, okay, that sounds great to people who haven't been keeping up with what's going on, but Benjamin Netanyahu does not want a ceasefire. He has been sabotaging these ceasefire negotiations month after month after month. If you don't believe me on that, why don't you go ask some of the organizations that represent the Israeli hostage families? Why don't you go ask them? Because they've made it explicitly clear that they believe that Benjamin Netanyahu is standing in the way of a ceasefire deal, of a hostage deal. So, again, it's a pretty simple case. Reject the Biden administration's policy. I know you're in the administration. It's difficult. It's a shitty thing to do. But okay, too many civilians have been killed. That's not going to be enough. It's just not going to be enough. It's the same shit we've been hearing. Now, a couple other updates and I'll end off this video. We also would hear as pointed out by Andrew. He says that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is a total mess right now. No markups since April, right? That basically means there's no real progress being made in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. There's no real debates that are happening or advancement of, amendments or things like that. There are no markups since April. Why is this happening? Well, nominations are piling up and there's no end in sight as Republicans continue to deny markups until Democrats agree to take up an International Criminal Court, or ICC, sanctions bill. Chuck Schumer said to Punchbowl News, I've never seen this before. Republicans are holding up markups in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee until there is an advancement of a bill to sanction the International Criminal Court for doing what? For daring to consider sending out arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, two of the most notorious war criminals in modern history. So because the International Criminal Court decided to abide by international law and is attempting to hold Israel accountable for violating international law, some of the most obvious and brazen violations of international law in modern history, because the ICC dared to do that, now our government, the U.S. government, the same government that just recently invited Benjamin Netanyahu to speak to Congress to 58 standing ovations, they are now threatening to sanction the ICC and even some of the family members of top ICC employees. This is the low that we have gotten to in this country. Not only is it enough to excuse genocide, to arm, to fund, to give cover for a genocide, but we will actually use the leverage that we have as the most powerful government on the face of the planet in order to attack and go after and sanction anybody who dares to go after our little buddy, Israel. This is fucking insanity. Now, if you thought that it was just Republicans here, right? Because I saw this initial tweet and I looked a little bit more into it because Schumer's saying here, right, I've never seen this before. This is crazy, right? There was also this quote from the same article. The leader of the Senate Democrats just casually saying he has hated the International Criminal Court forever. Here's the quote. Ben is trying to get this done in a bipartisan way, Schumer told us in a recent interview. Quote, he's willing to compromise. I want to get something done on the ICC. So he's in favor of doing something to punish the ICC. But he says, I've hated the ICC forever because I've always thought that they've been vehemently anti-Israel. Anti-Israel. They're now anti-Israel, again, for daring to try to hold them accountable for brazen violations of international law. That's their fucking job. That's the entire reason the International Criminal Court exists, is to stop situations like what Israel is doing right now in Gaza. That's the whole reason you would have an international body like this. But no, they're just biased. They're all just anti-Semites. In fact, the entire world, the vast majority of the countries around the world that recognize a Palestinian state, that want this genocide to end, they just hate Israel because they hate Jewish people. They're anti-Semites, whatever the fuck. It's so lazy. It's disgusting. It's despicable, but it's also just so lazy. The ICC, vehemently anti-Israel, so we have to go after them, right? Now, meanwhile, Israel is over at the United Nations making some of the most comically dark, monologues, I guess you would call this, that I've ever seen in my life. Here is Israel at the United Nations.
Colleagues, as this may be the last time for me to address you as Israel's ambassador, though who knows, perhaps another session will be called because of more terrorist propaganda, I would like to leave you with this. I have been immensely, immensely proud to represent my country here, the most moral country in the world, the most moral country in the world. You listen, Palestinian representative, in this warped place. I hope one day you will also see the bias and perversion of morality here, and I pray that you will see the truth. The terrorist organization that this guy represents here and tyrannical regimes should be condemned, not protected, and that Israel should be praised. We are today the vanguard of civilization. We are the vanguard of civilization. But until then, Am Israel Chai. Thank you, Mr. President.
The vanguard of civilization. A pretty loud dog whistle there, right? If you understand what I'm saying. The vanguard of civilization. He also personally attacks the Palestinian representative, right? Which, by the way, I believe at this point, still Palestine is being held up from having full membership status by the United Nations by the United States at the United Nations, by the way. But he's going after the Palestinian representative at the UN, saying he's the head of a terrorist organization, basically. And then he also says that Israel is the most moral government, the most moral country in the world. What are we doing here, guys? What are we doing? Does anybody take this seriously? Unless you're this guy, or maybe Biden takes this seriously, I don't know. This is something we hear all the time from them. They say, oh, the IDF is the most moral military in the world. It's like, Jesus Christ, really? The most moral. The most moral. You can make a very solid case that they are the least moral military in the world, the least moral government in the world. It'd be a tough case to make. There are plenty of immoral governments that are committing widespread atrocities right now, but you could make a solid case there for Israel. Anytime I feel like that a government or a military is saying we are the most moral in the world, should probably set off some red flags. This is when you know you've completely lost the goddamn plot. You've lost the plot. You are off the deep end. A vast majority of the world does not take what this man just said seriously. They don't. This is only taken seriously in like the United States and maybe some parts of Western Europe. The rest of the world is I mean, obviously disgusted at this, but also laughing at this because it's just that comically ridiculous. Most moral army in the world, but has somehow, obliterated tens of thousands of innocent men, women, and children, destroyed the vast majority of housing and civilian structures in Gaza. They have attacked farmland and the water infrastructure in Gaza to the point now where there are worries of a polio outbreak, as well as widespread starvation because Israel has been blocking the aid from getting into Gaza. The entirety of the healthcare system, the education system, obliterated at this point. They've targeted aid workers, they've targeted journalists, but they're the most moral government, the most moral country, the most moral military in the world. It's a sick fucking joke. And if Kamala Harris wants to make a clean break from the Biden administration, I'll give her a chance. You got a little bit of time here. Make your position clear. I'm not going to completely write it off that she could do something differently. Again, I think I've made the case that there's a window of opportunity there. That I don't think she's as extreme on this issue as Joe Biden or as Donald Trump, but you got to make the case, and you got to make it fucking quickly.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying